only other Caribbean country in the mix with paternity leave, Mr. President, as a matter of legislation, when I say Caribbean, I mean CARICOM country, is Suriname. No other CARICOM country has a paid paternity leave. Prime Minister says to us all the time, Barbados must not be afraid to lead. On the matter of paternity leave in the Caribbean, Barbados has not been afraid to lead. Mr. President, there are a handful, and I've already cited who they are, and the ILO has a report, ILO ECLAC report, it's called Time for Care Bulletin, and it talks about, and this is the information that I'm drawing this from, Mr. President, so it outlines where this information can be found if anyone is interested in finding it. So, I am satisfied, Mr. President, that Barbados is playing in a space where we have an expenditure that is associated with maternity leave benefits as it currently stands, extending that maternity leave for an additional period, as I will get to in the bill, and then further extending that, Mr. President, to the fathers by introducing for the first time paternity leave. That developed countries with trillion-dollar economies have introduced this and have the wherewithal in their national insurance schemes and systems, however they're structured, to be able to make these payments will not create an equivalence for Barbados with a much smaller economy. But it means that we have the ability to make the commitment for a social policy reason, Mr. President, and to commit to the investments in family. That brings me then to what the legislation itself has set out to do. The legislation sets out to do a few things, Mr. President. In the first place, it focuses on the mother, the paternity, maternity benefits. And so I'm going to speak to what we have in clause 4, the grant of maternity leave to employees. In the first instance, Mr. President, it replaces the Employment of Women Maternity Leave Act, Cap 345A, with this particular piece of legislation. And of course, there are going to be consequential amendments that will come to the NISS Act, which we would have passed, Cap 47, and a series of regulations arising therefrom, and then also in the Prevention of Employment Discrimination Act of 2020. These are all things that were announced in the budgetary statement of June of 2025 by the minister with responsibility for finance in the Ministry of Finance. And he announced at the time that we would introduce this measure. The bill then moves to extend maternity leave from what I had when my daughter was born, 12 weeks, 3 months, to 14 weeks for a single birth. If a mother has a baby, a single baby, then she is able to go off on maternity leave no more for 12 weeks, but for 14 weeks. And I have already shared upfront what the cost of that has been to the National Insurance Scheme. And I always say to people, I find myself sitting and talking to people a lot and trying to explain government policy, because I realize a lot of times that government and governance are not things that obviously they're not taught in schools, they're not interacting with it. If you're not a part of the process, you don't necessarily realize that A connects to B, to C, to D, to E, and it has a direct correlation on the things that you think you want but don't realize what it costs. I deliberately wanted to share what it costs the state, and in particular, the National Insurance Scheme, to make sure that as it currently stands at 12 weeks, we are able to extend these benefits. If we were to then combine, Mr. President, as we do now, the further extension of 14 weeks to mothers, the provision, Mr. President, in the legislation for additional leave captured in clause 8.1, where in the event that something has happened and there's the recommendation from a medical professional that the mother has complications of some kind, then those cases allow for extended leave. If there is a complication of the baby, where the child needs additional medical care, anybody who has had a preemie, anybody who has had a baby with medical issues, who has to spend their time or wants to be close to their baby in the hospital, is going to be therefore eligible for this additional leave on the basis of advice from a medical professional. And this is captured Mr. President, in the additional leave section, section 8, clause 8.1 of the legislation. Then it goes on, Mr. President, to introduce the newness that I mentioned before. 3 weeks given to fathers. 3 weeks given to fathers in addition to their annual holiday to be able to be a part of that early, very precious time to spend with your newborn and to support the mother. The legislation then covers that in clause 5.1. In clause 5.1, it says that the father is required to provide a couple of pieces of documentation. In the first instance, clause 5.1a, a certificate issued by a medical practitioner setting forth the expected date of birth of the child, and then secondly, a certificate issued by a medical practitioner or a midwife setting forth the actual date of the birth of the child. But then there are some additional things, because if you're a mother, there can be no ambiguity that you've given birth. If you're a father, you then want to make sure that you're clear that you are the one whose child has been born. And so the legislation acknowledges that practicality. The legislation then says that where you are the father, you have a couple of additional things that you need to provide, including a note from the mother saying you are daddy, right? So that is a fairly simple requirement that is expected to come about there, because the legislation recognizes that mothers and fathers need to be a part of that child's life. Then it talks about the protection for parents, Mr. President. That is captured in the legislation at clause 9.1. And I want to park there for a moment, perhaps to go back to where I started. The legislation covers a couple of things. One, during the time that you are on maternity leave, during the time that you are on paternity leave, approved, employers are not allowed to dismiss or to give you notice of a dismissal at any time during that period, or even under the additional leave that I have covered under Section 8. You are not allowed to give notice of a dismissal to an employee so that it would expire during the time of maternity leave, not when she's pregnant, not when you're asking her to resign during that time of pregnancy, and you're not meant to force a person to resign. Then it goes on in clause 9.1.2 to speak also about what happens during the paternity leave period. The same thing happens here. And then subsections 1 and 2 would not apply, obviously, where there are exemptions, where there has been a serious misconduct or gross negligence amounting to abandonment of duty on the part of the employee, and then it lists those kinds of things. I want to take a moment then also to go to clause 10.1, protection of seniority rights, because this is where I wanted to land when I made reference to when I went back to work. Where a female employee has been granted maternity leave under the Act, when she goes back to work after baby has had the benefit of mother and father, and mom goes back to work, she cannot be denied her seniority rights. She cannot be denied the ability to be reinstated in her former work or equivalent work. And she shall not, by reason only of the fact that she went on maternity leave, be paid a lower remuneration than what she was paid before she went off. Her vacation days, her sick days, and her any entitled leave remain her entitlements, any training or promotion on resumption of duties. And the same thing applies in the case of paternity leave. Now, Mr. President, I wanted to point those sections out because those are matters which are legislated. Those are things which are already covered in employment rights law. But you know, in all instances in life, there are the hard things and then there are the soft things. And I remember when we talk about, we talk about gender policy, we talk about equal rights for women, equal employment, and so on, there are those hard things that can be legislated. But then there are those mindset things that we probably also need to attempt in softer policy, moral suasion, but also in speaking to employers to address. I, as a woman, have always made it clear, you cannot make decisions for me. You cannot determine what I can or cannot do because I have a young child. If I am entitled or if I am next in line to go off on training, if I am next in line to go off on mission, if I am next in line to go off to take on additional responsibilities, you cannot decide she got a young child home, she ain't gonna be able to give this amount of time and effort to the job or to the responsibility or to the task at hand. So you pass that mother over in favor of somebody else because you have made a decision that she has other responsibilities that are not yours. That's not your place. That's not your place. You as an employer cannot, or, and I don't mean just an employer, supervisors, managers, CEOs, persons in authority over other persons. It doesn't have to be the big boss or the company owner. It oftentimes it will be persons who are in positions of authority. You cannot make decisions for other women because they have taken on the role of motherhood. You cannot take on responsibilities for other women or other men who have now been coming back off of paternity leave. Oh, he can't work late, he got a young child. That's not your decision to make. Tell me, as the employee, what you want me to do because it fits under my remit. Let me decide if I can do it. If I cannot do it, I will say so. But it is not your decision to make. And this legislation speaks to the hard things, but we also need to be able to create the culture and the mindset and to socialize people, especially males who like to make decisions for women. I will make my own decisions. And I see the men in the chamber looking at me, and I'm not even looking up at you all. Deliberately. But for the hard things which can be legislated, there is an enforcement provision in this legislation. And this enforcement provision speaks about you can find it in clause 10, I spoke about it before, but also clause 11, where it puts the remit under the Chief Labor Office to be able to adjudicate in the event and to levy fines if they are found to be guilty. There are a number of consequential amendments that obviously then have to be made to the National Insurance Act, as I mentioned before, Cap 47, and the benefit regulations of 1967 to be able to bring the bill into effect, and this will allow the family leave bill to be fully implemented. So I've gone through the legislation, Mr. President. I have gone through the policy objectives, Mr. President. I have also started out by looking at the cost of taking these measures, Mr. President. And so I want to make the following points as a matter of policy now. This is a government that has invested significant resources in family policy. This is a government that, through the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, has invested in the development of policies that focus on our children. They have been in the same ministry focusing on the expansion of the parental support programs, whether you are a single mother, whether you have a child that is in need of assistance, whatever your supporting mechanisms are, the minister and the ministry with responsibility for people empowerment, they have taken responsibility for making sure that there is a whole of country and a whole of government approach to parenting, to rearing children, and to making sure that the structures that support our systems are in place. The largest and the most I have had, Mr. President, over the course of this past year, I have led in my own ministry 2 amalgamations, I should say 1. An amalgamation of the energy company, which I've spoken about before. I've started Business Barbados, which is an amalgamation of what used to be Business Barbados and the business facilitation. But the largest amalgamation in this country's public sector, Mr. President, sits under the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs. And it is the amalgamation of all these social empowerment agencies, from Child Care Board to deal with children, from the Welfare Department to deal with those who need additional support, from elderly care to deal with those who are typically benefiting from home health services and all of that. This piece of legislation, Mr. President, that we're debating here today collides perfectly, even though it sits under the Ministry with responsibility for labor, it also fits neatly within the government's social policy framework, where this government is committed to investing in families. Now, Mr. President, there's a conversation also under this ministry about things like crime prevention and the need for us to make certain that we speak specifically into the lives of our young people starting in their homes. When children bond with parents, there is a moment that you will never forget when that child was born, when that child first looked at you, when that child reached every milestone. Those first few weeks are important. Those first few years are important. Those first few years help to socialize the adult or the young man that your child or young woman that your child will become. And the investment in keeping families in the homes with their children in those early days after they are born, and then supporting them with social care infrastructure so that they have the benefit of supporting mechanisms when the child is getting older. Those are key elements of this government's social care investment in our people. Those things matter to people, Mr. President. And so this legislation is critical. It is groundbreaking. It is going to have financial implications. Yes, of course it will. Now, does the government have all the resources to do all that you would want it to do? I am sure that fathers may want to be home for the full 12 weeks or the full 14 weeks that the mother may choose. But does the state at this time have the ability to match the investment made by the trillion-dollar developed economies of the world that offer that expansive? It may sound fanciful to say that, and if you haven't taken the time and applied the rigor of thought to assessing how it is costed, then you can say all kinds of wild things. Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we expand it this farther? Why is it only so little time? Because we have to start somewhere, but I have established, Mr. President, that where we are starting is ahead of every single Caribbean neighbor, almost every single developing neighbor, Mr. President, by including an extension for mothers and including a brand new provision for fathers. Governance, Mr. President, is about balance. It is about balancing all the competing obligations of the state. It is about ensuring that you are a first mover while still protecting the crease. It is making sure you play the shots while you don't leave your wicket exposed, Mr. President, if you want to use a cricketing analogy, and I'm not a cricketer. But it is about making sure, Mr. President, that while you play shots by leading with a paternity benefit and an extension of maternity benefits, Mr. President, in your insurable earnings and making sure you are covered, that you do not leave your social infrastructure, you do not leave your national insurance scheme, you do not leave your financial commitments exposed to the extent that you then cannot afford it to make it available to the persons who are there. And so, Mr. President, I did not want to spend an extended period of time on this legislation. I expect that there is going to be a debate, and so I've anticipated what some of those things are going to be, and since I have the advantage of having 2 bites at this cherry, there are some things that I expect that I will say in my wrap-up when I close on this particular bill. But, Mr. President, I want to stand in support of this bill. I want to stand in support of Barbados leading. I want to stand in support of fathers. I want to stand in support of mothers. I want to stand in support of responsible governance. I want to stand in support of financial responsibility. And I want to stand in support of the balance between governance, social, economic, and fiscal responsibility, Mr. President. And with these words, I want to beg that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Worrell.
Thank you, Mr. President. And as with Senator Cummings and yourself, I would like to join in extending congratulations to the Parliament for the hosting of the 68th CPA conference just last week here in Barbados, and also to yourself, Mr. President, and the Speaker in the other place for your leadership, having both served on the Executive Committee for the CPA for the planning of the conference. Mr. President, I was really hoping that Senator Cummings would give me a little bit more time, and I'm hoping that it's not her intention to introduce new items in her wrap-up to the debate, but I join in supporting this piece of legislation, the Family Leave Act, And it gives a good opportunity. I always like debates where this chamber has an opportunity to speak on issues which concern the development of this country and the development of its people. And this is one piece of legislation, Mr. President, which I do believe should engage this chamber because in that we've always had maternity leave. We are now introducing the concept of paternity leave. And as Senator Cummins went, maybe a little ahead of many countries within this region, and also we may still be ahead of some countries in some developed countries as well, who are yet to offer paternity leave or to have it legislated. But in so doing, I think it also comes that you need to offer the explanation and the parameters around which it would be operationalized and utilized, and also to speak to the benefit of doing such, especially when we talk about the importance of our family structure and the importance of the growth and the development of our children. Now, this period of time for mothers in terms of having access to maternity leave has gone a long way in allowing mothers to bond with their children. And that bonding is also important in terms of the psychological, the emotional attachment, and instilling values even at that early age, and getting to know your children. So now that it is seen as being important to allow men to have that similar opportunity as well, I applaud the government in terms of taking the initiative to actually include paternity leave as a regular course of passage for men in Barbados and in terms of for families as well. We have to recognize that it's not only important for the women to have that bond, but it's also important for the men to have that bond as well. And in the family setting, in some cases, the women actually do need that support, especially in the first few days after a pregnancy, where they have the support in terms of being able to care for that child who is not accustomed to our regular sleep patterns. And, and there may be other issues, especially in a situation where it may have been a difficult pregnancy and on the mother, and the mother definitely needs that opportunity to have some rest. Because there are some mothers who suffer with postpartum depression, and having the support of the father at that time and during that period of time would go a long way in helping the mother themselves, giving her the space and the time to catch back herself, because she was carrying another person for 9 months, then there's the separation, and then you have all of this responsibility on you. So you now need that opportunity and that space to catch yourself. And in some families, they benefit from having extended family members or support group around them. But the best person to have would be the father of that child there with you. So it is important that we recognize that. And then we have a culture in Barbados. The legislation also needs to speak to the culture in Barbados and recognize some of the issues of that culture. We don't always all live in family units where the mother and the father are married or even live within the same household. And having the opportunity for the father to have that time to bond with the child is very important, even if they do not reside in the same household, or if they're not currently married, or if they're currently married to the mother. Then there are other things within our culture as well which we have to get accustomed to, because there are men which may happen to have children from more than one mother. Some of them may have these children being very close proximity in age, same time they may live in the household with one, but have a relationship with the other. Um, these, these are things, these are things that we do know happen within our society and is a part of our culture as well. And if it is, perhaps by the legislation we may want, I don't know if it is my business to change it, or if it is society's business to change it, or if it is society's business to set a sort of standard or norm. Set a standard or a norm, but maybe with the guidance of the legislation, you may help to push towards those things in terms of setting a standard or a norm. There are some cultures which emphasize the importance of marriage before having a child, or emphasize the importance of if you become pregnant, you seek to get married and then continue. I don't know. It is not for me to say individually if that's the way that we should go. That is a conversation that we will need to have as a nation and make those determinations. But I do think that where such situations do exist, that legislation should not discriminate and make it seem as though one group is better off than the other, and that another group is not necessarily preferred. Because at the end of the day, it is still a father. At the end of the day, even though the father may not live in the same household, the mother more than likely will take them to the magistrate's court for benefits as well. So they should have the right of access to the leave, the paternity leave, and the opportunity to bond with the child as well. If it is that we want for the ideal situation to be all within a family structure, that would help to foster a better family relationship for the growth and development of the country, well then, those things need to be emphasized. But I don't think at this stage that we can discriminate and say, well, look, that because you are not living with the parent, or because you recently filed for paternity leave for another child from another mother, that you cannot be granted paternity leave at this time. Because that same father may have in their mind, and it may also encourage them to build that relationship and that bond with that child. Because we have far too many scarred children in this country who, because of such situations, they grow up not having a relationship with their father or both parents, and the scars eventually manifest themselves later on in life and in different ways. And we will still have those social issues to deal with, the scars that that child grew up with, not having a father or not having the support of the father to support them as they grow up through life, and that the father is only seen as the person who drops off the child support, either at the magistrate's court or directly to the parent, or drops off a couple bags of groceries every month or at the pay period. We want our fathers to have a role in the life of their children and the development of their children, and giving them that opportunity to form that bond at such a tender age will be important. And I think that it will go leaps and bounds in terms of dealing with some of the social issues which you have in this country. If more fathers take up that role of having an active role in the life of their children, and many of them do, even in those circumstances. Mr. President, even as we go through the legislation, and we do recognize that the legislation repeals the one of, I think it was 1979, the Employment of Women Act, maternity leave. But there are a few things in the legislation which I have issues with. And there are a few things in legislation which I have issues with, and it's expected because we are not here to rubber stamp everything, but the importance of Parliament is to give good critique. Not everything can be implemented now, because we've started, but perhaps the improvements can come later. And by having discourse at a high level like this, it will help in the development of the country that you can't necessarily, you won't be perfect with everything up front, but as more people weigh in, you may be able to bring further amendments to the legislation to improve upon it, to make it more forward-thinking, and to make it more in touch with the reality of which we live in. So I want to draw attention to a few of those issues. Now, the first issue, the legislation removes section 3, I believe it is, yeah, section 3.3. Well, I would want to say that it removes some sections of the old legislation, which is the section that deals with an employee, A, must, in order to qualify for a grant of maternity leave, be employed for at least 12 months by the employer from whom she requests such leave. Now, that is still within the legislation, but it takes out the part, is not entitled to maternity leave by the same employer on more than 3 occasions. And I'm happy to see that that part of the legislation has been removed. But why couldn't we have gone a little bit further and also deal with 3A in terms of the duration of time in which you must be employed in order to qualify for maternity leave? I'm happy to see that the section limiting the amount of times a mother can apply for maternity leave being removed, because it's basically saying to some persons, well, you can only have 3 children. But we are now facing a situation where we are encouraging Barbadians to have as many children as possible, to have more children, so that we can increase our population size. As you recognize, our birth rates are declining, and we would want persons to increase the birth rate. So I'm glad to see that that portion of it has been removed. But what I am disappointed is that we maintain the 12-month period in which you can qualify for maternity benefits. I believe that at this time we could have done a slight adjustment to that. And we could have done a slight adjustment in terms of bringing it down to less than 12 months to 6 months, based on the principle that, one, an employee can qualify for vacation leave in less than 12 months. Because, as you would know, if you're employed, your vacation leave is prorated, and after 9 months, you can actually claim vacation. So what are we then saying to women? That you have to be employed for 12 months before you can claim maternity benefits. Yes, I do know that when you go back to the NIS benefits, that you need to have a certain period of time in terms of benefits, period in which I think it is either 26 weeks of benefits in. I believe it's 26 weeks, and then you know that they always try to confuse you with 16 weeks in the 2 previous quarters, or whatever the case might be. But even the national insurance is not as rigid as the 12 months. So why couldn't we amend the legislation so that it would fit more in line with the requirements from national insurance? And there is good reason for doing that at this time, because we need to look at who this piece of legislation will likely affect, especially now saying that you have added on penalties as well, of $10,000 for false notice or whatever the case might be. And also given the reality of the time that we are in. Now, we say that our population is declining. And we Or you say it? It's a fact then, thank you. It's a fact. I'm glad to hear them agreeing with me that it's a fact, that our population is declining, and that we would like Barbadians to have more children. But yet, we still have within the legislation a requirement that you must be working for 12 months before you can qualify for maternity benefits. In some jurisdictions, I believe it is the UK, you qualify for maternity benefits from day one of being employed. Now, who is this likely to affect? The persons who are likely to want to start a family are more than likely persons who are now coming out of university and probably getting their first job. So you are saying to those persons, look, hold off on getting the child and put some time in the workplace. But then for those same persons, you may fall into a trap, because for professional women, it is probably better for most of them to have a child early in their career, so that, or even before their career gets off and running, to have that child, so that the requirement for leave and stuff like that is taken out of it. You've already had the child. So the persons who are more than likely to be affected by this 12-month requirement are young families, just out of university, just got married, just started their first job out of university, and they're being told, look, they have in their mind, I will not qualify for maternity leave because I just got the job, so maybe hold off a little bit longer. And then the number of children that they can likely have will reduce, because you're asking them to push their the start of their family to a little bit later in their careers, and therefore being cautious at that stage. Instead of having 3 children, they may only end up with 2 or 1 child. So you have to look at how it's going to impact on persons and the current situation that we're in. Is this really encouraging young Barbadians to have children where you just got a job, you happen to become pregnant, or when you got the job, you didn't know that you were pregnant, because that's also a possibility as well. You didn't know that you were pregnant when you got the job, and then you have to, your maternity leave within 9 months of getting the job, and you face that situation where you don't qualify for maternity leave, or the employer makes it difficult for you to get maternity leave from the company, because that 12-month window is there, so you're in breach of that 12-month window as it is written into the legislation. Do we really want to put our young people through that situation, or could we avoid it altogether? I think that if we go back to a 6-month period, or do without it altogether, that it would help to avoid a lot of confusion, and even the need for some of the penalties within the legislation as well. I do not think that an employer has any right, and this is what this legislation gives, to dictate to a mother or to dictate to a family when they should have a child or when they should become pregnant. And I don't think that you need to put young people who are seeking employment in a situation where they may need to hide the fact that they may be pregnant in order to get a job. Because that is also a legitimate concern. A lot of young people coming out of university nowadays, they know the difficulty of getting a job, and you send to all of these applications, and you get that one call for an interview when you least expected it, and you happen to realize that you are pregnant. You just got back the results a week ago that you are pregnant, and now you face this thing: do I need to disclose this to the employer beforehand that I am pregnant? Will I be breaking the law by not disclosing them? Will this information, or will I possibly be breaking the law or putting myself at risk of a fine if I just got the news that I'm pregnant 1 week ago? I had up my applications there for years. No one never called, but I just got this call to come in for an interview. what am I supposed to do in that situation? I don't think that we need to make pregnancy in Barbados a criminal activity or pregnancy in Barbados something that should be hidden. I think that the legislation could be a bit more flexible in terms of the period of time of reporting time. Either take it to 6 months or do away with it completely. And obviously, you would have the period of time in terms of benefits with the contributions to national insurance. And then that's another step, the decision that we will have to make as a government, because if our policy is really in terms of building families and encouraging our people to have children, we need to make some decisions, because when you look at the numbers, even $5 million in maternity benefits is not as much that was spent on Carrie Fester. Even $5 million in maternity benefits is not as much as the $60 million which was wasted in the housing. And if it is going to a necessary good in terms of the people of Barbados, I don't see that as an issue. Even $5 million in maternity benefits in a year, I don't even think it comes close to the Prime Minister's travel costs. So when you consider raising a family and developing a nation, $5 million is nothing that a $9 billion economy should really be having issues with, especially in a situation where we contribute to the NIS benefit, and it is the NIS benefits which will pay the maternity benefits. We speak about wanting to have more children to contribute to the NIS. Later down the road, do what is necessary to encourage persons to have those children. So consider removing that period of time. It may not be able to be done now, but it's something. It may not be able to be done now, but it's something that can be considered, and any progressive government or progressive parliament would give serious thought to it and be able to put those measures in place. Now, Mr. President, there's another aspect of the legislation which I believe that we could have gone a little bit further in terms of maternity leave and paternity leave. But we speak only to the birth of a child, but we remain tone deaf to the fact that there are people who adopt children, and remain tone deaf to the fact that even the Child Care Board may be encouraging persons to foster children as well. And even if you adopt a child as an infant, the parent still should have the opportunity to bond with those children just the same way as someone who gave birth to that child. So perhaps another amendment to the legislation would be that we need to go as far as to including children through adoption and also foster parents as well. Because you have a situation where I am certain that our Child Care Board would be glad if more persons, more families who are unable to have a child naturally by birth would come forward and adopt the children within the Child Care Board setting. And should then not be entitled to the same leave, both maternity and paternity leave, to have the opportunity to bond with that child as well. So I believe that that is something that we need to consider as we look to improve on the legislation to include the issues of adoption and foster parents, so that they too would be entitled to the leave as well. They have every right to have that opportunity to bond with their children, because the child becomes their child after the adoption process. So that's one thing that we need to consider. Now, next issue. In the legislation at section clause 8(2), and I read it. A male employee who is eligible for paternity leave may extend that said leave beyond 3 weeks for an additional 3 weeks if the mother of the child dies during confinement or immediately after confinement. Now, I think that this is an oversight within the legislation. If you're offering paternity leave and it's a situation where the mother dies during delivery or during the confinement period, but then obviously the father becomes the sole parent of that child. And to extend the paternity leave of the father by just an additional 3 weeks seems like we are a little insensitive to the situation. Why not, in a situation like that, extend the paternity leave to the father to the equivalent of time of the maternity leave? Because obviously, the father now has to raise that infant child by himself. He has the grieving process to go through. If you have others, children within the relationship as well, you have to console them with the loss of the mother. So if we are going the route of offering paternity leave, in a situation like that where the mother dies during birth or confinement, to offer just 3 additional weeks to the father is insufficient. And I think that the legislation can be bold enough, even today, to go as far as to say that the father will be entitled to the equivalent amount of time as the mother in terms of leave, because the father now becomes the sole parent of that infant. And that time would be necessary, not only in bonding, but also in terms of dealing with the whole emotional crisis of a death of a loved one, and also supporting other children if that is there as well. So I would want to put that to the government to consider that the opposition is actually helping, and we are putting this as a recommendation to you. I don't think that it will rob the NAS or the Treasury that much, and hopefully there will not be that many fathers who would have to face this situation. But obviously, it is a situation which happens, and it is possible. So if you're offering the paternity leave, at least in that one case, make it equivalent to the length of time for the maternity leave in that situation. So that would be section 8.2, which I would hope that you will consider amending to include that. We need to go a little bit further, Mr. President, with some of the legislation. I want to go back to now the requirements for the father to how he goes about submitting for the paternity leave. Maybe a bit bureaucratic, maybe it could be a little bit easier, a little bit more flexible in terms of, because you have to take into consideration, he has to get the letter from the mother stating that he is the father. We already have a process for that in terms of the birth certificate, which would have the father, if the father goes in and signs on the birth certificate that I am the father of this child, maybe that should be sufficient. But then there's also a bit of rigidity in terms of the granting of the paternity leave for the father. In the legislation, it states 2 weeks within the first 3 months, and then a following week within the before the end of the 6-month period. Why do you need to confine the fathers to determine how they will take their paternity leave? Could we not be a little bit more flexible? And if it is only 3 weeks that we are offering, you say to the father, you have 3 weeks, you can determine how best you want to take that 3 weeks. Because you may also find a situation where the father might prefer to take their 3 weeks after the mother goes back to work, so that the child has an additional 3 weeks at home with a parent. So you can have that level of flexibility by not forcing the father into the time period in which they must take the leave 2 weeks within the first 3 months and then the following week before the completion of the 6 months. Give the father the flexibility to choose how they intend to take the maternity leave. They may take a week now and 2 weeks later, or determine that they will take all of the time towards the end of the period, or however they choose to do it. In terms of the paternity leave, we are doing this as an introduction. So yes, the employers have to get accustomed to this, but I'm hoping that at some point in time, we can extend the amount of time given to fathers for paternity leave beyond the 3-week period. So I would not want to put a figure here now, but I'm thinking that we should build in our mind that we intend to increase the, and you could do it incrementally, where you can possibly say, well, after the first 2 years of the legislation, it will be increased to, say, 6 weeks, and or go up like that, so that the employers have an opportunity to adjust to the concept of granting paternity leave. But I think that if we can extend it beyond 3 weeks, I'm certain that the fathers will be happy for that as well. Now, it also must be told to the fathers, just the same way that you tell the mothers, it is maternity leave, it is paternity leave, it is time that you spend with the children. It is not an additional vacation. It is not time to take a cruise. It is not time to go gallivanting. So I know that within the regulations for the national insurance, any time that the mother spends overseas while she's on maternity leave, she will not be entitled to the maternity leave unless she's overseas for medical care. So that same thing must be explained to the fathers as well, because they're not bound the same way as the mother, who would probably have to be at the home nursing the child. So that must be explained to the fathers, that it is paternity leave. You're expected to spend the time bonding with your children. It is not an opportunity for you to go to Miami to buy, even if you say it's to buy diapers because they're cheaper over there. It is paternity leave. You're expected to be in country with the children, and it is not an additional holiday. And I'm glad that the legislation says that you're still entitled to your holiday, you're still entitled to your sick leave and all other leave. But you must make it clear, paternity leave is not an opportunity to gallivant. Spend the time bonding with the children, and if you are getting the funds from the state, make sure that you stay in Barbados. It's not an opportunity to go on a cruise or a 3-week holiday somewhere. It is paternity leave. So you need to make those things clear, because it is a new benefit which you are getting. Don't abuse it, because we want for it to continue and for more people to benefit from it. So you need to make these things clear within the regulations and how you go about applying for the leave as well. In the legislation, there's another issue where a father can only apply for paternity leave once within a 12-month period. You might got some problems with that. But when you meet those fathers, I hope that we find a way to deal with those. Because I know that there are some fathers in Barbados that just had a child and the other one already on the way. So, within the same year. So you may have some issues with that, so you might need to give that a little bit of consideration. I would leave that to the legal team to determine how best to go about it, but that once in 12 months may seem like a problem, but the fathers can negotiate, because you might be able to take the other side. If you don't have that rigidity in terms of being confined to when you take the leave 2 weeks within the first 3 months and 1 week and 6 months after, you might still be able to give the other child the full 3 weeks in the start of the second year. So maybe that will, and I'm hoping that you did not make it so rigid because you anticipated these situations. Again, we can't judge people. So we can't place our standards on everybody. You need to make sure that all fathers, as long as they are standing for the children, have access to the paternity leave. So take out all of those restrictions and make it a bit more flexible for our fathers to apply for the paternity leave as well. Now, the legislation, because we've had this legislation on our books for a number of years in terms of the maternity leave legislation. So going over things like protection of seniority benefits and stuff like that, I don't think that as a country that we need to do this at this stage. That I think is well understood, and employers do understand that. The burden of proof of fathers, I think I would have dealt with a little bit earlier, and we need to take away all of those things that would deter persons from coming forward. I would really hope that we would consider removing that 12-month period from the legislation. The leader of government business gave a good overview internationally on how paternity leave has been implemented. Now, and I think that Barbados needs to be bold. We can't say in some instances that we punch above our weight and then we are meek and timid when it comes to social legislation which benefit the people. Even though other countries may not be there as yet, we see the benefit of having this legislation on our books because our number one resource are our people, and our family are that important to us as a country. So anything that helps to encourage the development of family, anything that helps to protect children, anything that helps to give a child a head start in terms of that development, because that emotional attachment to parents at such a young stage, it goes a long way in the psychological and the emotional development of the children even later on in life. And that emotional attachment between a child and the father, especially when we recognize that that is one of the weaknesses within our society, that we do not necessarily have that strong emotional attachment between children and their fathers. Anything that we can do as a country to help build on that, because children need that man in their life for guidance, and not just to be seen as someone who help them to come into the world, but someone who is there supportive of them and there for them every step of the way. So anything that we can do to enshrine those values and that culture as a country, we should not be timid about it. We should go forward with it and set an example for the rest of the world to follow. Because the numbers that you mentioned, we have a multi-billion-dollar national insurance scheme. So spending $6 million, which may double to $12 million on our families, I'm saying to Barbados, it is worth it and can definitely, but we need to also value what is spent on our people and our development and make sure that it goes in the right direction and in terms of building on that. I don't think that there's anything else that I would like to add, and maybe Senator Cummins would, I'm hoping that the new items that she hoped to bring in her wrap-up.
Mr. President, I rise on a point of order.
What's the matter?
The honorable member has been speaking in the House. He said it a few times, and I deliberately allowed it to pass. I don't believe I said anything about introducing new items in my wrap-up. I did say that there were things that may come up during the course of the presentations to which I would have the opportunity to respond and to provide any additional information in my wrap-up.
Thank you for the clarification. Proceed, Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. President. You don't need to pick a noise at everything, but I am hoping that Senator Cummins will take into consideration the amendment to the legislation to give the fathers additional time in the situation with the death of the parent during childbirth or confinement, and also look at reducing the 12-month period for notice or to qualify for maternity benefit to a lesser period of time, possibly 6 months, or in line with the national award of national insurance benefits. We have the issues with the fines as well. Now, I can on this, the fine has been increased for the employer, which was the only fine included in the legislation before. And I believe that the employers need to be a little bit more compliant in terms of the granting of maternity leave and the paternity leave as well. The fine of the $10,000 for the parents, I really hope that we won't have a situation where that would need to be enforced, but if we definitely reduce that notice period, you would have less of a situation with that. And our medical scheme is of such that I don't think that you will have a doctor giving a false report in terms of a person being pregnant or not. And if it is that the name is there on the list, maybe we need to go to the stage of doing paternity, which is something that is being talked about, paternity testing, from an early stage, because it does cause problems within the legal setting in terms of a number of men go before the magistrate court to, with the claim that they're the father of a child, and then to find out many years later that they're not the father of the child. So the only way to get around that, not by a penalty, but perhaps we may need to start introducing early paternity tests so that we can have that as a process, as a part of the process. And with those few words, Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Worrell. Other speakers? Senator Malou.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll just a brief few words. I'd like to say, first of all, that I consider this a necessary bill, and it is in line with globally what is happening. I think that the amount of time that is offered to the father seems to be appropriate for our circumstances. We can't do just as the Senator Worrell has said, that we have to start somewhere. So I think all of that is appropriate. I do have one area I'd like to touch on, though. You know, our fathers have a duty, they have a role. And this legislation talks here about the benefit that we're giving the father. I don't really consider this to be a benefit for the father. And I think they're going about this slightly the wrong way. The person who should benefit from this should be, the people who should benefit from it should be the mother, who needs the assistance in the early days, and the child. So I would like to say I am the father of 4 children, and to the Senator's point, I have 1 adopted child, 3 biological and 1 adopted child. Fathers bond after the child is born. Mothers quite often will bond with that child from the time they feel the first little butterflies or little air bubbles they talk about, you know, those first things that they feel in their stomach. But as fathers, in my circumstance, I can't speak for everyone, it's not until you can actually see and hold and feel and that the bonding really starts. You get a little bit with listening and feeling those first kicks, but otherwise you don't. But my point here is that I would have hoped that the legislation might have had something in it that put a requirement to actually do with that time that which it was given to you for. This is not a reward for getting someone pregnant that 9 months later you get an additional 3 weeks off. And I want to agree with Senator Worrell on that. I really think that it would be put in the wrong light to be seen that way. And I think that it would be good for us to find some ways that they could enforce that. And perhaps one of those ways might be, sir, if in fact that father who has had the benefit of those 3 weeks off is later finds himself before the court for not fulfilling duties otherwise, whether that is in the not paying for the support or some other way, that there might have been some teeth to go back and say, but hold on a minute, you you got the benefit of 3 weeks off and were paid by the government of Barbados and you're not fulfilling your duties in this other way. But it's hard for me to attach those things together. We do, at the end of the day, have the cultural reality in Barbados and in certain parts of our society. The children are growing up without the fathers being present in their life, and we're all paying the price for that, and that is unfortunate. So, sir, as I said, I think that this bill is appropriate. I'm glad to see that we are joining the global right thinkers, maybe, in recognizing the role that fathers have to play with raising their children. But I do think that it is not a reward for getting someone pregnant. That is the easy part. Being a father is the difficult part, and you must then find some way that we know that these fathers are using that time as it was intended to support the mom in those first few weeks when it is extremely difficult. And sorry, I spent a few more minutes on this. My personal situation with having a mother who had 3 C-sections. In that first week or 2 weeks or even 3 weeks after birth, just lifting the child is near impossible. And I was lucky. I had the benefit of 2 grandmothers that were alive and many different aunties who would help. Many people are born and the mother does not have that level of support. So I have lived it. I know what it is like and how important the father would be there. So I think that this is essential. And I did it at a time, as many of people in here I'm sure have as well, when there was no paternity leave as such, but maybe you took holidays. That's when you took your holidays, right? And even if you didn't take your holidays, you know, you took 1 or 2 of the shifts at night for the feedings or the changing, and you went to work the next day a bit tired, but you did what you could. So, sir, with those few words, I support this bill. I do hope that we can, in some ways, change the culture, that it is not a reward for having a birth, but rather it is an obligation, a duty, and it helps us to raise better people. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Vinal. Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good morning, afternoon to my colleagues. I believe I'm taking the words from Senator Boyce. I'm compelled to speak on this matter, albeit just for a few moments, because it is landmark legislation for us in this country to recognize the role of fathers and the importance of the role of fathers in the rearing of our children. Barbados traditionally being a matriarchal society, it was generally almost felt, or somewhere in the minds of men, that the children belong to the women and that they are to look after them. And I'm glad that we've taken this step to not only impress upon our men the importance of their role in the nurturing of children, but also to seek, and I pray that this legislation will, in some way, help to build family life in this part, in our country, because for too long there has been the notion that, and even in the mind of some men, that their role is simply to contribute a few ounces of biological matter and a couple of breakfast things later on when they're needed. But the reality is that what we're seeing, without the empirical evidence, what we're seeing in our society today in terms of, as one minister recently pointed out, most of the people going into our prisons are teenagers. And it says something about the stability of our family life in this country. And I know that though we're talking about the early stages, I believe those early stages are very important. Senator Mallalieu would have given his experience 3 times over. I can only speak about it once, sir. Once that I'm certain, very certain about. Let me just make that. I heard a comment over here. So once that I'm certainly certain about. No, I'm saying that for the gallery here. I had the opportunity to bond with my daughter before she was born, because I realized that in speaking to them, they respond to your voice and so on. And on the day when she was born, she was crying down the hospital, and as soon as she heard my voice, she stopped. Just went very quiet because it was a familiar voice that she knew. And in my line of work, there was no paternity leave then, but I was not at as busy a parish that I'm at now. And I had some time to be home with her when her mother had to go back to work. I remember one day I took her with me and I went into an establishment. And when I went to the counter to speak to the young lady there, she said, that's your child? I said, yes, it is. Where's her mother? I said, well, her mother is at work. And she left her with you? Because it seemed rare that a father will have a child that young walking around with. But I hope that that becomes the norm in our community, where men are bonding with their children and building that critical bond at those early stages. And though the 3 weeks is a short time, it is what we can afford at this point in time, but I pray that in time we can extend it, where our men will have a longer period of time, not only to bond with their children, but also to share in that moment with the mothers as in those early stages of life, and to support and assist in the caring and raising of the children. I believe that this will go a very long way, though we may not be able to put a finger on it now, in terms of enhancing family life within our community. And one of the things that we really need to focus on now is family life. I want to commend Senator Worrell for his presentation and some of the issues he would have raised. I would have been coming down in my car from Mass when he spoke about false declarations and so on. And I was just joking that sometimes that may not be the fault of the father. But that's the reality of the society in which we live as well. But I want to commend him for making that critical point that, though he would have had this political slant, making the critical point that this is an investment in our children and in our families in this nation. And I do not believe that $12 million or even $15 million a year is too much to invest at that critical stage in terms of fostering family life and impressing upon fathers the importance of the role that they have to play in their children. Because the reality is that if it is not done then, and there's no real bond being developed with these children, then perhaps we'll be paying out that 15 million somewhere else, where we do not want to be paying it out. As I would have said in the speech some time ago, the words of the prophet Haggai should ring in our ears constantly, that we do not earn money to put them into a bag with holes, that we make sure that what we do is done for the betterment and development of our people. And that is something Barbados has always been known for, the development of people. And recognizing that a few weeks away from work is not going to close the business. We've seen that through COVID. All the time we used to spend running around and having to be in the office and this and that and the next, you realize a lot of it was a waste of time. And some things can be done more efficiently and just as efficiently in a shorter space of time. I would even advocate sometime down the road for a 4-week work day where people can just spend some time detoxing from the busyness of life and spend some time building family life and improving the happiness index of our country, because we spend so much time working like the hamster in the little thing, just going around and doing absolutely nothing at the end of it, you know. And so this is good legislation, a good step in the right direction. I want to encourage all Barbados to embrace this, but also the men, as they've heard. Yes, we call it a benefit, but recognize it is just what is expected of you to help to care for your child. And so we're giving you that space to be there for that period of bonding with child and mother, and to fulfill your role as a father in our community. So with those few words, I wish to thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Rogers. Senator Trim.
Mr. President, colleagues, I rise in support of the Family Leave Bill 2025. It is a piece of legislation that, in my view, represents one of the most important ways and one of the most important steps that the administration and this government has taken in recent years to rebalance how we as a society treat work, family, and care. I do so because when I speak on this bill, I do so without any children of my own, but with deep awareness that in many senses this bill goes beyond pregnancy and even beyond policy and the paperwork that we see before us. I do so because what we are debating is not simply about family leave, but it really is about whether we as a society have the capacity or the will to reimagine the world that we have always known and the systems that quietly shape how we live, love, and labor. It is about fairness and justice and recognition that care work is work too. Work that for a very long time has been done primarily by women, silently and without pause or praise. Mr. President, so this moment for me invites us to consider that we should share and transform that care work that is done into a collective responsibility. A lot of times I think about the world that we live in, particularly my generation when I'm on social media seeing some of the conversations, and the world that is now much more progressive than what my parents entered or my grandparents may have foreseen, but one that is still very much bound in traditional ideals and values, ones that we often disagree with. For example, when I left university, having a child was the furthest thing from my mind. I very much viewed it as something that I would do down the road. It was not a priority because I was very much intent on getting a career and building a nest so that I could take care of a child in a real and meaningful way. And so just the idea that this bill speaks primarily to young people is one of those outdated ideals, particularly because we see now that in a world where before we talked about women having children before 30, and at 30 the sky was falling and you couldn't have kids, we see women entering their 40s and now starting the journey of maternity because that is part of the progress that we have experienced. I also know that I grew up in a household where I saw the burden and the beauty of care, and I often think of my mother as a married single woman because while my father lived with us, a lot of the responsibility of taking care of the children, the housework, the planning, the emotional labor, going to parent-teachers meeting, it was done by my mother. When we host back-to-school programs, oftentimes what we see primarily would be mothers accompanying their children. And this isn't to say, because we assume when we see this that mothers are single parents or that there's no man in the household, it isn't to say that there is no man in the household, it is to say that traditionally we have gifted, not even gifted I want to say, we have pushed care onto women under the idea that women are naturally nurturers and men are protectors, even though we have come such a long way. And so my mother carried it without complaint like many women in her generation and even many women today, because that is simply how the world works. And if I don't do it, then who will? And so while I honor her strength and the strength of other women like her, I made a very quiet vow to myself that I would not replicate what I saw. And I did not accept that as what should be. And I know that many of my counterparts in my generation do not. I also say this knowing that not every home looks like mine, that there were families where fathers were active and went and played on the, took their children to dentist appointments and were at parent-teachers meeting and were very much involved. But I saw this as the exception and not the rule. And so when I think about fatherhood and should I have children, the kind of father I would want my children to have, it is one where a presence of a father is not a novelty. It is not something that we swoon about. And at some point in time, I stopped swooning when I saw a father with his child. Not because it's not a beautiful thing to see, but really and truly because it is not something that should be revolutionary. because it should be a standard to have active fathers actively parenting. I want a Barbados where a father holding his child's hand in public doesn't make everyone act as if we are witnessing a magic trick. I want a Barbados where we nod in recognition of good fathers because we know that this is the standard that we have set. Earlier, it was said that we weren't, the honorable member, the opposition senator, Senator Worrell, mentioned that, he wasn't sure if it was the role of the law or this should come first. But the reality is that we know in Barbados that some laws have allowed us to shift from certain mindsets to others. We could look at things like the autonomy of women to make decisions about their bodies, and also the law that removed bastards from the books. The idea that law should encourage cultural changes because that is what we are in the business of, creating space for progress. And so I want to see boys seeing their fathers changing diapers, cook dinners, comfort tears, and the tenderness that does not take away from manhood, something that we typically act like it does. And so we have been conditioned by quiet traditions, a lot that we rarely pause to consider and we rarely question. They rarely announce themselves, but they still shape our everyday lives. These old traditions and ideas are not always loud, they are polite, dressing themselves in love oftentimes, but their most endearing disguise is normalcy. That it is, and it always has been, and so it should be, and we ought to just allow it to occur. And so the way that we talk about caregiving as help is one of those traditions, as if the woman is supposed to do these things, while the man is supposed to lead the household and the woman is just there to help, and childbearing and taking care of the household, things that are jobs, things that take time and effort and energy and strength, that's just how it's supposed to be, offering assistance. So let me confess that oftentimes I tell people that I don't like cooking. I don't like cooking. It is not the top thing on my list any day. I will eat out before I cook every day if I could, much to my mother's frustration. But the response that I get is, how do you expect to have a husband and children? And so if my value is tied to the meals that I prepare and the domestic roles that I assume, Mr. President and colleagues, I want to say that if the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, then that is not love, that is survival. And it should not depend on my cooking because we have a bigger problem. I also want to say that in a modern Barbados, both men and women can feed themselves. And so this bill is more about leave. It is also about liberation and reshaping what family means, what fatherhood looks like, and what equality feels like in daily life, because these old ideas that we have do not simply harm women, it also disenfranchises and impoverishes men. The way how we talk about fatherhood and how we talk about masculinity, they steal from men the freedom to be gentle, it steals from them their ability to be vulnerable, and the deep participate, the joy that comes from being involved in family life. We often tell men, society that is, that men should provide, but they should not feel, and to lead, but not lean, to protect, but we don't offer them spaces to connect. And in doing so, it deprives our homes of balance, our children of presence, and our societies of a real sense of wholeness. And so when we deny men the right to care, we deny families the fullness of love. But when we give them permission and grant them through the bill that we are here today to debate, homes become gentler, and we see it in general in our communities. And so this is not just legislative housekeeping, we are also doing some cultural house cleaning. We want to ensure that care is something that is everybody feels as though they have the right and the privilege to offer, allowing men to bond with their children in the earliest of days, It begins to normalize that fatherhood is not symbolic or just about money, and that motherhood is just not about martyrdom and sacrifice. It allows us to escape outdated expectations from gender scripts, and it makes it a lot more balanced, more dignified, and allows for us to live more true. And so this bill really replaces a framework around a single gendered experience to one that recognizes what modern family life is. It moves away, because the bill prior focused on maternity. There is no mention of fathers in the previous bill, and it moves towards where we recognize that fathers and care indeed is a shared human responsibility. I want to say, because I've heard it uttered externally, and maybe it is for headlines or political points, but the bill does not seek to concern itself with when or whether a woman should have a child, but rather it concerns itself with that whenever a family is formed with a child, however that looks like, that the law stands to support and not to judge. It means that fathers are allowed to father without judgment and without waiting on the whims and fancies of an employer to decide, yes, you could have a day, you could have 3 days or a week, because there are companies that grant time off currently for paternity. And so if the last century of labor reform and what we have done has been to free women to enter the workforce, then the next set has to focus on allowing for men to enter the home and not to define masculinity by absence. And so the bill, and I keep saying this, changes that story. One of the things, and I heard it mentioned before, that I look forward to seeing, because I think oftentimes we act as though bills should be perfect from the outset and it should cover every circumstance that may arise. And we should see legislation not as a ceiling, but in every instance as the floor. And the reason for that is because if we think about what is occurring in the world of work in terms of AI and remote and the gig economy, it demands for us to continue this conversation, because we have to continue updating it to match that. And so I am certain, and I look forward to being able, of course, to expand for men who unfortunately face the sad circumstance where their partner passes during pregnancy or within childbirth, are also granted the length of time, because this bill is about compassion. And so ensuring that we continue to build on that is very important. The last thing I want to focus on is that this bill calls on us to reimagine labor itself. For too long, a lot of times we treat workers as though they are, when they leave the workplace or when they arrive at the workplace, it is a separate and distinct person. And so the work of caregiving and of supporting households is something that has to be integrated in how we treat the workers, because you are a whole person. And so what we are doing is correcting that distortion, that fathers or mothers will go home and they don't need the support anymore, or that care work is not work, so it's not as important. And so we are ensuring that families are more stable and that communities are stronger, because when homes are healthy, workplaces function better. And it's not a social luxury, it is an economic logic. And so this government has focused on people-centered labor policies that recognize that justice at work cannot exist without justice in the home. And so we value not only production, but also reproduction. The old ideas about gender roles have cost us a lot, Mr. President. It has cost us in burnout, in broken homes, and in lost potential. This bill writes a new story. And so the well-being of families is not a private matter, but a national strategy. And so it tells employers that their duty does not end at the office door. And it tells every mother, father, and caregiver that they are seen, valued, and supported. As we look past this bill, because as I said, we need to continue building on the bill, of course, as the world of work continues to evolve. We aspire to the ideal, but we ground ourselves in reality. There are things that we aspire to, but we simply cannot do in the moment because we may not have the capacity, or we may need to test the boundaries of our social infrastructure in order to make sure that when we make a commitment to the people, that we can keep that commitment. And so we are imagining a Barbados where family and equality sits together, where employers know that men are expected to be engaged, and indeed men know, fathers know, expecting fathers know that they are expected to be involved at the start and all the way to the finish. And if I am any example, there really is no finish, because I still call my mother at the slightest inconvenience. And so it means that we recognize that paternity, as mentioned before, and fatherhood is not just something that you do and, you know, a child happens and then sometimes you drop off cash and sometimes you see them, but that you know that you are supposed to be involved. And we have men around Barbados who set that example and show that, but once again, we are working to make it a rule and not an exception. And so we're not talking about fatherhood so that it is whispered about anymore, so you feel ashamed or you don't want to do certain things with your child because of how society may view you, but we celebrate fatherhood for what it is, where family-friendly policies are not something that we have to negotiate, because every employer sees it as an imperative for their business. I'm talking about a Barbados that investing in the well-being of Barbadians and families for productivity, stability, and compassion is standard. And so I imagine a Barbados long after this bill is passed and long after this debate has concluded that recognizes that today was a great step towards ensuring that we reframe how we view fatherhood, how we view families, how we view the way that we work together, and ultimately how we view care. Because, Mr. President, I believe that if we showed care a lot more, a lot of the challenges that we are having would cease to be. And so, with those few words, I want to say that when we build a nation that honors those truths, we are not just modernizing our laws, we are fulfilling the promise of progress to Barbados. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Trey. Senator Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with your permission, I would like to say a few words about a recently concluded event. I think that when we hear repeated that we are at times punching above our weight, our recent experience at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Conference, I would say displays that, sir. And I'll be brief and say that I think that the organization was excellent, and I think that persons like you, the President of the Senate, the Speaker and the other place, and the Clerk of Parliament, and all the organizing committees must have done tremendous work for it to turn out the way it was. I'd like to congratulate you all. With regard to the bill before us, Mr. President, I do not have a lot to say. Senator Worrell and the leader of government business have done very good jobs of laying it out, almost in a brotherly fashion. However, Mr. President, I would like to make a few comments about Section 6 of the legislation. It begins by pointing out that the minimum period of leave shall be no less than 14 weeks. And in Section 2, it's 2A, it speaks specifically for persons whose confinement took place before being granted maternity leave. As As a doctor, I presume that means for somebody who had a premature birth. But I'm conflicted because of the conflicting legislation. If we accept that prematurity is a special state, and the newborn requires special care that's extended, because essentially when you reach 3 months as a premature baby that was born at 28 weeks, you're not really being born. But there's no provision in this legislation that definitely assures the mother that she will have extended leave. It actually says that if the female employee so desires, well, certainly that couldn't have been the intention. It couldn't have been the intention that a mother who delivers a premature infant that's in the ICU for 10 weeks would be given the option that if she wanted, she could have additional leave. I can't imagine that was the intent. So I would like to suggest that we should probably look to revise it. Another thing, Mr. President, is it does not make any provision for children who are fostered or adopted by families. And it speaks to birth, specifically to birth. And I would like to suggest that there should be some amendment or some other way of finding it so that children who are also adopted can be treated like all other children in terms of the parenting and the bonding and everything that must occur. And my last point, Mr. President, relates to the opposite end of the spectrum, where someone is now what we call in medicine post-dates. In other words, you deliver after the estimated dates. And it gives that person not the option, it says the leave shall be extended. So on one hand, for a premature baby, the mother has a choice of extension, but if you deliver late, you have to get the extension. And I think it really needs to be sorted out, Mr. President. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nair. Senator Andeli Voice.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me for what will be a very brief intervention. I stand to support the bill this afternoon for all of the reasons articulated by my colleagues, but also because it represents a continued investment by the government of Barbados in the care economy and in the expansion of social policy aimed at benefiting the average Barbadian, and in the fine tradition of the Barbados Labour Party, Mr. President, improving the lives of all. Sir, the bill does a number of things. It, as I indicated, continues that tradition of social progress for which this government is well known. It faces, or in some tangential way, helps us to face what is one of the country's most pressing issues, that issue of population replenishment. We know the statistics well, that Barbados, unfortunately, has the lowest population growth rates in CARICOM, and that the birth and fertility rates are below the levels of replenishment, Mr. President. And, I'm sorry? Replacement, my apologies. Thank you. I put it to you, Mr. President, that it really is policies like these, policies that look at the perennial issues of this country and find solutions for them that will improve things like the birth rate in this country and ultimately improve the lives of Barbadians. I heard the Honorable Senator Worrell earlier in the framing of his comments, certainly in my own interpretation, seemed to avert the notion of perhaps not enough investment. And I do apologize if I'm misquoting you, although that was my interpretation. And I think that there is nothing perhaps further from the truth that this legislation, Mr. President, sits alongside a number of interventions by the government of Barbados that seek to improve the care economy. We see the construction of a geriatric hospital, Mr. President. There is a robust community elder care program. Sir, there just 2 weeks ago, the Minister of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs broke ground on a respite center for the elderly and persons with disabilities. And these are just some of the investments that the government of Barbados has made in ensuring that we create an ecosystem of care that supports persons at all levels, and that we take a life cycle approach to the provisioning of care. There was a time in this country, Mr. President, where we talked about care only at or near the end of life, when you were old, or perhaps at the beginning and the end of your life. And like my colleague indicated, that much of the care responsibility on either side of the spectrum rested and resided primarily with women. This legislation goes some way, Mr. President, in making a difference in that regard, and for that, the government ought to be commended. The legislation principally, as the objects and reasons indicate, is about the provisioning of leave to both men and women for the care of children at a particular stage in their life. And I want, Mr. President, that while I commend this legislation and commend men, particularly men of my generation, for their increasing and active participation in the caring and rearing of their children, to also underscore the fundamental importance of other systems that support, sir, the caring and rearing of children. And by that I mean that there are too many instances in this country where fathers are precluded from the caring and the rearing of their children by virtue of the approach taken by courts in this country that certainly in my view on these matters do not move fast enough. And certainly in my view, that approach or of a lack of efficiency certainly endangers the Barbadian family. It endangers, Mr. President, the very relationship building that we seek to inspire by virtue of this through the constituent parts of this legislation. And it is a matter, Mr. President, that we have to face, because children are the victims of that lack of efficiency, for want of a better term. Fathers are the victims of that lack of efficiency. And if we believe, as it is clear that we do, that the strength and continuity of the Barbadian family is essential to our national development, those are issues that we must fix. Quite similarly, Mr. President, I would wish to call on the private sector to perhaps first to commend the private sector agencies that in the running of their entities support families and support care responsibilities. By that same token, Mr. President, I think that a great deal more can be done, and certainly that a great deal more actors in the private sector space can join the cause of supporting women in the early parts of child rearing and caring, but also supporting the sandwich generation, Mr. President, of Barbadians who also have responsibilities for parents and grandparents as they face so many of the serious challenges that ail them. And so it certainly is my hope that the private sector is cognizant of these needs, and that as time goes on, there will be continued investments in ensuring the stability of the nation, Mr. President, through the required support. I did indicate that it was going to be a brief intervention, Mr. President. Permit me to end by commending the government of Barbados for building and fortifying an ecosystem of care through a series of social policy interventions, and I don't need to repeat them for you now, but through child protection legislation and disability legislation and elderly policy, and ultimately this piece of legislation, Mr. President. And, sir, as we recognize that the stability of the Barbadian family is essential to the continued growth of this country, may we continue to do everything in our power to keep it strong, stable, and ever thriving. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Andrew Boyce. Senator the Honourable Lyndall Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am happy to be able to participate in this particular debate. I am the proud father of two lovely daughters. And I remember, and I'm speaking now about back in the 90s, the 80s, when I had my first daughter. I remember particularly how excited and happy I was to be able to rush home during the lunch hour, just to be able to have a little look, a little play with that kid, even at those age of a few days. I, of course, in my time, would not have had the benefit of being able to claim paternity leave. But, and so I recognize then how important it was for a father to also be able to put in the time, particularly in those initial weeks. And you don't realize it, but in those initial weeks when the child is beginning to sense things, begin to see things, and begin to recognize voices and so on. And that kind of bonding, I believe, in my opinion, stays with you and that child for a lifetime. And so I want to commend the relevant ministry and, of course, the government, of course, for bringing this legislation and updating it and modernizing it to where it is, because I think it is important as we look to improve on things which we think are important for good family life in Barbados, that we recognize that these are one of the issues. And we recognize that, Mr. President, the level of issues which we have with our young people today, particularly, especially among young men, I've heard it said and repeated often that one of the issues is really the lack of that paternal connection in the household. And so I am calling on the men, and I am merely echoing all of the speeches, nearly all of the speeches which, and speakers that would have gone before, who have been calling on the men to step up to the plate. And use this now and recognize that this is your opportunity to really bond and to build with your offspring. I remember, and I don't hear about it now, but in the days of an organization called MISA that was spearheaded by the then Ralph Boyce, who has gone to the great beyond. But one of the things I remember that he was particularly strong on is for the men to be able to have that kind of access with their children. This is another piece I see in the puzzle of getting men to take on that responsibility, to be able to play their part in the upbringing and the upkeep of their children. And so again, I want to stress a comment that was made again by nearly all the previous speakers, that men need to recognize that this is not, this grant of paternity leave is not an opportunity to have a little extra vacation or to go and to lime on the block with the other fellows or to do all other things except that it is given so that you can give the kind of emotional support to the mother who would have just come out of a very stressful childbearing situation, to give the kind of support to the child that is necessary in those initial days and weeks, and to recognize that that is what this leave is really designed to do. We don't want that, having gotten this legislation to this point, and I have to say that, you know, in doing a little research for this particular debate, I recognize that in the Caribbean, there's probably only one other country right now, maybe two, that has paternity leave on the statute books. So we in Barbados, I see this as showing leadership in this area in the Caribbean, and that as a government, the government is prepared to bring Barbados into the modern world. As a matter of fact, you know, even when you do the little research on in some of the first world countries in Europe and the UK and so on, you find that paternity legislation is not, in all cases, on the statute books. In the UK, for example, you know, they give, I think they give a few days, perhaps 3 days or something like that, as paternity leave. So, in a way, you can say that Barbados is now gone past some of those first world countries in terms of putting this kind of social legislation on the books. And I think the government is to be congratulated in taking that kind of leadership role. Mr. President, there is just one little thing which I looked at in this legislation and which I thought I would mention, and that has to do with the period of time in which a person must be employed before they can claim the paternity or maternity leave. I think it's covered under sections 4 and 5 of the legislation. And what I was saying is, I understand there has to be some kind of time involved before eligibility. After all, you can't walk into a job today and expect that you should want to be able to apply for maternity or paternity leave. But I think perhaps it is an area which government can look at as we go forward and see how that can be adjusted. And I say that because if you take, for example, a sector like the construction sector, where there's a rapid turnover of staff, mainly men, it's going to be mainly the males, but a very rapid turnover of staff. You probably go and you work with a company while they're doing a project for 6 months, and when that is done, you go and we work with another company that's working on another project. So you don't have that continuous period where you are with an employer for 12 months. And therefore, in that situation, those men working in that industry may find themselves a little bit disadvantaged. Now, no legislation is perfect. We know, as I said before, this is really quite a bit of new legislation. It will need to be adjusted and amended as we go forward and as we learn more. And this is something that certainly we can look forward to. There are other things that we would need to look at as well, and they're going to creep in as we come along. I mean, I throw it out, for example, as the world changes, how do you deal with things like same-sex couples? Those are issues that will arise, and we will have to collect the data to be able to analyze it, to be able to determine how we adjust the legislation to be able to deal with those kind of issues. But I think this is a good start. I think it's a good piece of legislation. It's certainly not contentious, and I am happy to be able to support this legislation. Mr. President, I am obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. Any more speakers? If none of that, Senator Cummins to wrap up. Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, permit me to focus a little bit on a much more narrower perspective on the bill than my colleagues. The bill in reality is an employment statute in the same vein as the statute it intends to repeal. And while my colleagues have focused on some of the broad social development objectives, population concerns, and even the enhancement of the role of men in families, this is, after all, a simple employment statute as intended to make greater provision for the rights of women in the workplace having given birth to a child, and to make new provision for men, and indeed provision for the family to take leave collectively, which is a great step forward, but it is, after all, an employment statute. And I propose to make a few brief comments on the strengthening of that legal framework and to answer some of the questions posed by some of my colleagues in relation to why the bill is framed in the way it is framed and how we can look potentially at any legislative amendments in the future based on how the rollout of this new legislative scheme works over the next couple of years. But, sir, I hold the view that the law fastens not on principles but on remedies, and I'm sure that there are persons in this room who have heard me make that statement in a different forum, and they're hiding their face from me as we speak. But that is not necessarily a real popular legal maxim. The law fastens on, not on principles, but on remedies. It is a more practical statement of the reality that, in effect, if the law doesn't bring a resolution to a solution or a problem, then it has no legitimacy. And in this case, I want us to focus a little bit on what it is that we are intending to do. Now, I will go straight to the issue about the 12 months and why there is a period for a woman to be employed by the same employer for 12 months. This is not to penalize any women who have moved from job to job or to disincentivize people from leaving work. All throughout the employment legislation in Barbados, most of the rights accrue after 1 year in a job, if not all. Senator Worrell made reference to holiday. Under the Holidays with Pay Act, that right accrues after 1 year. What I believe the Senator Worrell may have misconstrued was that your right to a payment can accrue even before the year has elapsed. And if your employment is terminated, you're entitled to a payment equivalent for that period for which you have worked. But you don't have the right to a holiday before the year expires. Under the Employment Rights Act, another employment piece of legislation brought in by the last administration, a person does not have the right not to be unfairly dismissed unless that person has been working for a year. So there is some consistency, and I believe I would say there's some internal consistency where there are rights accruing within the sphere of employment legislation in Barbados to anchor this with the fact that a person should be employed for a year before any benefits under the legislation, under the National Insurance, under the Holidays with Pay Act or the Employment Rights Act. All of these are predicated on the basis of an employee working for a year. But I want to make the point, Mr. President, that if indeed this is a situation where the payment for maternity benefits comes directly from the National Insurance Fund, short of any perceived disruption in the business of an employer, then it really doesn't matter if the employee is working with that particular employer for a year, if the employee has made a number of contributions to the National Insurance Fund, having been employed previously. Because if it were that the employer was paying or had to pay a maternity benefit, like how they will have to pay holiday with pay, then you can prorate that to the period of employment at that particular place of employment. So perhaps when we are talking about changes or we're looking to see how this act is rolled out, we can consider relaxing not necessarily the length of period for a year, but removing the requirement that you have to be working with that particular employer, for a year. Basically what I'm saying, Mr. President, where an employee has been working and making contributions to the National Insurance Fund and making what we consider under the National Insurance Act and regulations, the minimum contributions, perhaps even if they move from one employer to another and they continue, there's some continuity in the benefits that they are paying in, then they should be able to qualify even if they change their job. And that would take away the specter of somebody having to consider whether they need to leave and go and get another job as opposed to having a child. And I think that is a better way of dealing with it rather than just reducing it from, say, 12 months to 6 months or anything of that sort. The important thing is that this is an insurance managed fund from which contributions are being paid in by working people. And therefore, the ultimate consideration in my humble submission would be the number of contributions the employee has made and not necessarily the time that they have spent at a particular place of employment. But I wanted to correct the perception that there are ways in which you can lower the entitlement to benefits for under a year as a solution to the perceived problem by Central World. Because in reality, that is not the case. Where the employment is terminated, your benefits accrue based on the time you have spent. But if you're ordinarily working in an environment, a place of employment, you're not going to get those benefits until a year has passed. And that is a consistency in the employment legislative framework that if we were to follow his solution, I don't understand how we can have some consistency in our legislation and just have that knee-jerk reaction. But I understand why he might be saying so, because this debate has gone on in other places in a way in which when I started to look at this bill, I thought I was actually dealing with something that was almost demonic, that was trying to marginalize women and do all the things that you hear in the roadside parliament and all those other places. But I want to assure the country, sir, that this is indeed revolutionary. It takes us beyond where we are. I have not heard any of the speakers really speak to the fact that we are extending the period for which maternity leave benefits for women, and that is something that should be applauded. But I also want to add my voice to the concerns raised about foster children. I come up in a family in which my grandmother had to go for her husband's daughter, who was born to a woman who died in childbirth. And she raised that child as her own. That perhaps is not going to be as common as it was back in those days, in these times. But indeed, we're grandparents, aunts, uncles have to step in when parents have died or become disabled, can't work. There needs to be some consideration of how we can extend the benefits under this legislation, because we have not broadened the legislative scope for this to make it a family leave bill and not an employment of women maternity leave act. We have not broadened the scope, and therefore perhaps we now need to look at a more family-oriented conditioning of how we apply the legislation. Because, as I said, the law fastens not to principles, but to remedies. And if we are going to do all the social developmental engineering that we have spoken about, Mr. President, we're going to have to deal with the reality of the family that we have in the country. Again, there is a prevalence of people having children from more than one woman. That is a Barbadian reality. And those fathers are required by the courts to perform the duties as a father to all of their children. And it is not a legitimate excuse that I have family obligations already existing to exclude them from any family situation. The courts will require all fathers, or all men, I should say, who have been adjudged to be, or determined or deemed to be, the father of a child, to make their contributions to the development of that child's welfare. So, I would want to humbly suggest that some consideration in the future be given to where a person, a man, has fathered more than one child within a 12-month period, that he will be able to benefit from that. So that if it is that a child is supposed to be born with a father, and that is one of the social developmental objectives of the legislation, then I don't think that the child should be penalized because the father has taken up with another woman in less than a 12-month period. We laugh at these things, but it's the reality of a lot of people. I can well remember being in court in Old Town, where there was an argument as to how many children this man had, because he was saying he had 3 children, but the lady was saying he had 2, so he should be able to support mine. He was saying, I have 3 other children. She was adamant he had 2. The magistrate gave a conditional order, interim order. And at the end of it, the man looked very upset. They said he can go. The next case was called, he stood in his place. The clerk said, for the second time, you can go, sir. The man stood up. He looked back to make sure the lady left the court. And as soon as she exited the court, he said, this case is also mine. I did not want her to know that this lady had a child for me.
That's not you.
But he preferred that to happen so that the order was made, but he in fact had 4 children. But that happens, that is the reality, and it may sound funny, but I saw that as an experience very, very early on in my legal career. So I am making the plea that when we have these situations, the law has to deal with them as well. We can't say it's a good thing for a father to play a role in the early developmental life of his child, but say, well, if you have more than one child, you can only choose, you have to pick which one. We can't be saying both things at the same time. This is not to encourage profligacy, or what Bajans will call the sweet daddy mentality, or sugar daddy mentality. But at the end of the day, we are talking about ensuring that the rights of a parent in their employment are secured when they are taking care of their family obligations at the time of the birth of a child. That is the paramount consideration which should override any operationalizing of the facets of this legislation. The importance of the bond between parent and child in those early formative stages should therefore guide how the law is applied. It should guide how the law is amended and operationalized in the future. Sir, when I got married almost 20 years ago, in his sermon, Reverend Paris, now Bishop-elect Reverend Paris, preached from the book of Deuteronomy and stressed about the importance of a family being a cohesive unit in the early formative stages. It's never left me. Deuteronomy 24, verse 5 says, when a man have taken a new wife, he shall not go to war, neither shall he be charged with any business, but he shall be free at home for 1 year, and cheer up his wife, which he have taken.
Did you obey that law?
I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Nichols. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to thank all of the honorable speakers who have presented on this bill. If there's one thing on which I think we have reached unanimity, is that this is a family leave bill, and it strengthens and supports the family structure in Barbados. There were a number of recommendations and queries raised by the legislation. Some of them were repeated, so I'm going to attempt to treat to them all in one. I believe that Senator Nichols, in his presentation just now, spoke about the rationale for the 12-month period, vesting it in the employment rights legislation, or suite of employment rights legislation. And so I will leave that as having been covered adequately. I would, however, also want to speak to the recommendations that have been made by many members, specifically about the inclusions that could be incorporated. And I did seek, in my initial introduction of the bill, to speak about the fact that you have to be able to rationalize where there is a start and what the evolution of the process would look like. The inclusion of things like foster children and adopted children over time will have to be assessed, and that has been a commitment already, and I believe that the Honourable Minister, who, along with his team, must be commended for introducing and piloting this bill, and I want to do so at this time. Thank you very much to the Ministry with responsibility for Labour and Social Security that has anchored this process. They are here with us today. But as they piloted this bill through the other place, the Honourable Minister did indicate that this is a first, this is a floor, and not a ceiling. It is the introduction and not the end, and it is a draw not on the same purse that pays other expenses, as has been mentioned by Senator Worrell in his political commentary. However, it draws on the national insurance scheme and not on central government. And there is a commitment that as we extend the maternity benefit and we include the paternity benefit, that the scheme will assess how this extension has been impacting on the fund, and then be in a position over time to make any evolutionary changes that may need to be considered. And that is a hallmark of responsible governance, to make sure that we protect the lifeline that we refer to as the national insurance scheme. So, Mr. President, I want to also acknowledge the recommendations that have been made also by, I don't want to call them recommendations also really, but the comments that have been made by Senator Rogers, Senator Trim, Senator Maynard. I want to just pause there for a moment, but the clause to which Senator Maynard referred, which is clause 6, does not have any reference at all to how it was interpreted by the Honourable Senator, and I did take the opportunity to consult with the Ministry with responsibility for Labour, and that is not to be the interpretation in terms of children who are born prematurely and the length of time. That is not what this section of the legislation referred to, and so I just wanted to make that correction for the record. And then to express appreciation for the commentary on social policy raised by Senator Andrene Boyce and young Senator Trim, and the same for Senator Lindell Nurse, and of course the legal explanations provided by Senator Gregory Nichols. Now, as I close, Mr. President, I just want to make one point that has been made by all of the honourable members who have spoken in different ways. We have spoken about the importance of family life. We've spoken about the importance of fathers being included in the lives of children. We've spoken about the importance of that bonding period and how that is important to continue even up until this day, where we engage with family life with the mother and the father as the foundation of the family. We spoke also about the law courts. Senator Nichols spoke about the law courts, and others mentioned the law courts as well. And I think that we all here have agreed that the role of fatherhood is not to be diminished. And I want to take the opportunity as I close to appeal to mothers. Do not weaponize your children. Do not weaponize your children against their fathers. Don't do it. You, at some point in time, loved, were attracted to, were interested in, were committed to this man. If it did not work out, it did not work out between you, the adult, the woman, and the man. The child who is a product of that relationship is entitled to have the benefit of both parents in their lives as long as both parents are willing to be there. We have long seen too many instances, like in the magistrates' courts that we heard being raised by Senator Nichols and others, where mothers are withholding access to children. This legislation speaks about families. It speaks about leave for fathers to engage in the same way, even if in an abridged version, with their children from the time they are born and for the duration of their lives. Our courts are not meant to be used in a way that is a weapon against fatherhood. It is not. I can tell you, like Senator Rogers, what it is to have a single child and to know what it is when I go back to work. Her father will probably take her with him where he goes, true. Her hair may not be plaited the way I may do it. She may not be dressed in the way I may want her to be dressed. He may not hold her in the way that I would hold her, but that does not mean it is not a parent who is taking care of a child over whom he is protected. I remember when the child starts to teeth, you may decide that you want to treat to that teething in a certain way. When a child is tired and colicky, you may treat to that. Fathers and mothers do parent differently, but it does not mean that one is less than. This legislation today is a part of that social and that cultural change that so many of us have spoken about. It brings fathers into equivalence with mothers. It starts to speak to the question of mothers accepting the importance of fathers in the lives of their children from the day of birth onwards. And I will say this to you, a child that you have weaponized from birth and at different points in their lives, they grow up. They grow up and they miss what you denied them and they never had the opportunity to have when they see it in others. They remember the weaponization and they crave for that longing, that belonging. They crave for that relationship with their fathers that you have denied them, and they will resent you for it. Let us give children their due. Let us raise children in this society as part of a community, as part of a village, and let us start in our homes, and let us start from that birth with this family leave bill. And with those few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Will those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I wish to revert to the appointment of a temporary deputy president of this chamber, and I beg to move that we nominate Senator the Honorable Lyndall Nurse to assume this role for the duration of today's sitting.
The question is that Senator the Honorable Lyndall Nurse be elected deputy president of the Senate for the remainder of this sitting. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The things the ayes have it. Senator Nurse, thank you for agreeing to serve. You are so elected.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further deliberation on this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The things the ayes have it.
Senate is now in committee.
Mr. Chairman, permission to take the bill in parts?
Permission granted.
clauses 1 to 9.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that clauses 1 through 9 do now stand part.
The question is that clauses 1 to 9 do now stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clauses 10 to 16.
Mr. President, Mr. Chair, I beg to move that clauses 10 through 16 do now stand part.
The question is that clauses 10 to 16 do now stand part. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Schedule.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that the schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill. Will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. And all those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Deputy President has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Family Leave Act 2025.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Family Leave Act 2025. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that we do suspend the sitting of the Honorable Senate until 3:10 p.m.
The question is that the Honorable Senate be suspended, the sitting be suspended until 3:15 p.m. today. Will those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Because the ayes have it, this sitting is suspended until 3:15 p.m. today.